Okay, hello, everyone. I'm speaking today from the City of Light to the person from the Dark Continent, Ernst van Zyl. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Hugo, for having me on. And I hope it's going to be an interesting conversation. I mean, you've been on my channel previous times before, so thank you very much for having me on yours.
Yeah, and I always enjoy your conversations, and today I think it's going to be just as interesting conversation. We saw you last week giving a speech in Parliament, or what do you call it, a testimony to Parliament about land expropriation in South Africa. Can you maybe give us a brief, for those who haven't seen the video, a brief summary of what you said to Parliament?
Right. So there were two presentations going on at the same time. Firstly, it was Ernst Roots talking to a parliamentary committee, or the ad hoc committee, on the amendment of Section 25 of the South African Constitution, which your South African listeners would recognize as the property rights section of the Constitution. And the thing is about what happened that day is that Ernst Roots was supposed to do two presentations. But then they called me and said, well, we actually need Afriforum's input at this other meeting or committee as well. But Ernst Roots is still talking. So I'm like, give me 5 minutes, I'll be there. So I threw together a speech. I first just wanted to use Ernst's speech, but then I realized I can't just duplicate it. It's going to look very weird. Even though the point will remain the same. So I threw together a quick speech, just a few key points. And then I, as you say in Afrikaans, I get my face uitgepraat, pretty much just talked on the top of my head. And
it sounded like you were in good company, because lots of other parliamentarians were doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, no, actually, I was very happy with the end product in the end. But I think the main thing was, and I think this is where some people might get confused. So as I said, Ernst Roots was talking about the amendment to Section 25 of the Constitution, and my presentation was on the expropriation bill, which is actually a new bill that the government proposed last year. So it's the 2020 expropriation bill, which is pretty much intended to give the government expropriation without compensation powers, without even the whole constitutional fight. It's pretty much just a little bit of a backdoor towards expropriation without compensation.
So I want to understand that. So my understanding is for the South African government to legally do or constitutionally do expropriation without compensation, they need to amend the constitution. And you were not speaking on that part. You were speaking on a legal bill to do the exact same thing.
Yeah. It's pretty much a legal bill concerning exactly what type of expropriation powers the government may have. So, of course, the government does have certain types of expropriation powers. They want to build a railroad. It goes through your farm, or your farm is on the border, and they want to use a part of your farm to build a bigger border fence. They have the power to pretty much take that from you. Oftentimes, they have to pay you compensation. With this new bill, it's an amendment to that the expropriation powers that are already in place, pretty much broadening the government's power to expropriate, giving the government pretty much power to expropriate your property based on very fluffy concepts like public interest, concepts like unused land or not properly used land, I think was the word that was actually used by a parliamentary member in my in the meeting where I was. So what this is going to do is pretty much give the government power to expropriate your property where they see fit, in regards to they're going to deem that your property is not being used properly, or that your property it's in the public interest to expropriate it, and that means they don't even have to pay you compensation. And now you can say that you can go challenge it in the courts. But here's the thing, is you're going to be on the street while you're challenging that in the court. So it's pretty much a expropriate now, challenge later approach, which is absolutely terrifying if you are a property owner in South Africa.
So and the definition of property here, my understanding from your presentation was that it includes basically anything you can call property. It includes my iPhone. Right. It includes my car.
Yeah. It includes your car, it includes your house, it includes your intellectual property, it includes the laptop that you stream from, it includes the pen that you write with, any type of property. It's pretty much an incredibly broad definition of property. And I mean, it's ripe for abuse. And that's what's one of the main comments that Afriforum had against the bill, was the fact that the definition of property is so broad that it's just open for abuse. And anyone that tells you that this abuse is not going to happen, don't worry. They don't know the ANC, or they're being disingenuous. I can't think of a bigger carrot that you can dangle in front of the ANC than giving them that type of power to expropriate. And that's what we're seeing here with this bill. And now, for if anyone wants any further like in-depth conversation about that, there's a conversation actually on Afriforum's YouTube channel called Afriforum's Comments on the Expropriation Bill. If you Google that, you'll find it, where I actually interview Johan van der Merwe, a lawyer that helped us with our comments regarding this bill. You also had a written submission. I did the oral submission. So if you're kind of more into the legal side of that, really want to get into the techniques of this bill, there's a whole conversation about that on Afriforum's channel, and I would recommend you check it out.
I will put it in the description afterwards. So I want to get here to expropriation, but to define it in the sense I think that many people understand it, which is land in South Africa. My understanding from government is that they've justified these things to try and address inequalities from apartheid, colonialism, since Jan van Riebeeck came to South Africa. So, some people go as far as the Roman Empire when they expropriated the land of my Germanic ancestors. But, generally it's the land issue in South Africa. That's what they talk about when they talk about expropriation. And of course, as you said, the bill actually goes much further to that. And I think the people writing the bill sometimes doesn't even understand what they're writing, which is part of the problem, But let's get to land. So land itself in South Africa, history of it, as I understand it, has been 1910 or 1912 Land Act South Africa, where the white government relegates a great part of the black population to what was not then yet called the homelands, but the reservations. And as time went on, the reservations doubled in size. And systematically, the idea was the reservations would double in size. This will create the grand apartheid idea. And Verwoerd had a word called terugstroom policy at this time, which meant that these homeland areas would develop and essentially suck the black people out of South Africa. But then there were also nuances to that, right? There was the black spot areas in South Africa, which was areas where black people did live and own land beforehand, which were expropriated by the apartheid regime. There was areas such as Sophiatown, for example, where the land was rebuilt, and they tried to build homes for poor whites at the time. But then there's also complexities to the history. For example, many of the land that farmers today owns in South Africa had no people living on it, or you couldn't find them because the population of South Africa wasn't that big at the time. So there's a big complexity as towards the history of land in South Africa. Yet in public discourse, you get a simplistic narrative. And why do you think that is?
Well, as with any populism surrounding land, the simplest rhetoric is always the most effective. And I know we're going to get to that later in the conversation, but that's actually one of the elements that I did my master's degree on, was specifically redistributive populism, which is a brand of left-wing populism that very much has a big focus on land and property rights. And the thing about these types of populist rhetoric, and the land debate is almost always associated with a strand of populism, or redistributive populism, rather.
So what is the history, before we get to populism, what is the history as you understand it, as Afriforum understand it, as the historians understand it? Because, it is a history that is, you can try to be objective about it, but it's obviously going to be value-driven, right? And it's coming through different views.
Yeah. So Afriforum's stance is very simple, and I think if you understand history, it's very complex. But there are simple ways of pretty much getting to the important parts. And one of the big important parts in regards to the land issue is this whole narrative around whites stole the land, which is probably one of the most erroneous historical observations of our time in the South African context. And pretty much to give more context to it, there were three ways in which white people acquired land in South Africa, namely settlement on empty land, purchase of land through treaties, cooperation and agreements, and then the most controversial one, and it did happen in parts of South Africa, which was by conquest. Now, many South African politicians and political experts like to only focus on the third option. But if you've done even a little bit of research into South African history, you'll know that the first and second ways of acquiring land were much more prevalent. The history of South Africa is full of stories of cooperation and treaties being signed and trade being done in regards to land. And I think something else that skews the statistics is the fact that there are large parts of South Africa that were never inhabited by what you would call today Black South Africans or Black Africans. Take, for example, the fact that the majority of land in South Africa you cannot do agriculture on the majority of land in South Africa without a borehole. Now, a borehole is a technology that the natives in South Africa didn't have. Black cultures did not have the technology for boring that deep.
To make it much simpler, if you take the population of South Africa at 1900, okay, it was just 5 million. Okay, today it is, 45 million? I think by year 2000 was 45 million. So statistics I got in front of me. Today it's over 50 million. So the population has increased tenfold since 1900. Now, 5 million people is the size of more or less Johannesburg. It's a little bit smaller. Johannesburg is actually a little bit bigger than that. So the entire South Africa in the 1900 had the population of Johannesburg. Projected back to the 1600, you're decreasing, you're getting to the millions, maybe even the hundreds of thousands. So it shows you that when the white population got to South Africa, and this is just a matter of historical fact, it was empty. When the black people got to South Africa, it was empty, right? It's impossible to take that population spread off equally over the hectares of the country. Everyone's going to own a city. What irritates me about this narrative is that nobody looks at population, for example. Nobody looks at migration, demographies. Nobody looks at agricultural revolutions. All of this has gone missing over it, and we assume as if the population of the country is stable and it's always been the way it has been. I mean, in the 1970s, the whites were 20% of the population. We are now going to be less than 5% very soon.
Well, another thing that a lot of people don't really take into account, it's actually surprising, and it's something I've thought about now recently, and I'm going to incorporate it a lot more into my arguments regarding land ownership, is the fact that a province like the Northern Cape has almost no arable land, but it is by far the largest province by surface area. It's 30% of South Africa's surface area approximately. And just to put that into perspective, the second largest province is the Eastern Cape, and that's only 14% of South Africa's total surface area. So this fact very clearly demonstrates how land statistics are much more complex than just percentages. A province like the Eastern Cape's land area strongly influences the national statistics regarding ownership, and the majority of that province isn't even arable. Another thing that I think is very important historically is to take the Western Cape into account. Now, the Western Cape, you can Google. This is actually something that will give you a lot of perspective. Google South African population density map and then by race, and you'll find it's pretty much government statistics. You can see where Black South Africans most prominently live, where white South Africans, colored South Africans, etc. live, and you'll see there's like a direct line going through halfway through South Africa. That's where the desert starts. That's where you don't want to live, because you can't really plant anything there without very expensive and high-tech technology. So when the Dutch arrived...
So interesting enough, when the French look at South Africa, they draw a line more or less across the Kalahari, to the Eastern Cape, I suppose the Kei River or wherever it might be. And they say that's the European side and that's the African side of South Africa. And then you've got Johannesburg being an enclave or an exclave of the rest of the country. So to speak to your point, and I recently gave a lecture in the United States about this, if you look at South Africa's population, as the ANC likes to, by the same way the apartheid regime does through race, you say, okay, we've got black, white, Indian, and colored, or black, white, Asian colored. You find the white and the Indian population is entirely urbanized. Very few of us still stay in the countryside. If you take the black population, it is still predominantly rural. It is urbanizing at a rapid rate, but it is still living in the countryside. The colored population, it is mostly urbanized, but it is scattered through the countryside of the Western Cape, and some of them in the Northern Cape, the areas that you can stay, because most of it, as you say, is dry, and quite frankly, you cannot do much of the land. And that, again, it goes missing in this whole nuanced debate of land ownership.
No, absolutely. And another historical angle that you need to take into account is absolutely the Western Cape. And now the Dutch arrived in the Western Cape in the 1650s, but only met the Xhosas at the Fish River in the 1770s. That's more than 200 years later. Or no, that's 100 years, 120 years later. And that's more than 900 kilometers from Cape Town. That's where it's historically logged that the first encountered the Xhosa tribes there. So I think that's also another narrative that is really is confusing people, is the fact that the Western Cape was never traditional land for Black South Africans, but a lot of them are migrating there now from the Eastern Cape for job opportunities, for better infrastructure, better service delivery there. But there's no claim to land there. I think the best example of that would be all these land claims that are happening around Stellenbosch, land claims happening in the wine regions of the Western Cape. It's very bizarre, but to a foreigner looking at that, they're like, well, but that's where they traditionally lived. But if you look at the history of South Africa, that's simply not the case. And to maybe build on that point of the agricultural stats, so something that I think is absolutely important that needs to be recognized, the fact that South Africa, and we touched on this earlier, is that South Africa is not blessed with a large amount of arable land. Arable land only covers about 26% of the total area of South Africa. This is potentially arable land, should be noted, not just fully cultivatable land. And more importantly, half of this is classified as marginally potentially arable land, which is only 13%.
But who gathers those statistics and how are they classified? Assuming it's climatic regions, it's rainfall. Because, just to speak to that point, in the Karoo, it's well known you've got sheep farmers. You cannot do anything else except have sheep on the land because they don't require that much rainfall. In Natal, for example, KwaZulu-Natal, sorry, I was still indoctrinated with the old names. You find that there's livestock farmers that can have long grass and very beautiful livestock, okay, because it's high rainfall over there. If you go to the north, Limpopo, for example, you've got avocado all over the place. So different areas have got different crops and they've got different potentials. But the problem, again, even with that argument, is we don't eat the same fruits in the same. We don't produce the same in the same region. So you cannot even put a productive value on land. It becomes very difficult because it depends on the market's demand. If we all go vegetarian tomorrow, the Karoo is useless, and so it's not all.
Well, I think that's a very good point. But then also, when you are talking specifically about arable land. And that's what the first thing that comes to mind if you're a foreigner and you think about the land question in South Africa. You think about, that's where South Africans want to plant their millies. Well, 2/3 of the country in South Africa gets rainfall levels that are pretty much globally classified as semi or true desert. So that's something else that a lot of people don't understand. And I mean, true desert areas such as the Karoo and the Kalahari cover 55% of the land. And this has resulted in a large difference between the agricultural potential of these two rainfall zones. And this needs to be reflected in the land values. And I think an analysis of the land already in Black ownership showed that no less than 80% of this land in the high rainfall zones already fall under Black ownership. And but this also needs to be understood in the context of where these high rainfall regions are, and that's pretty much on the eastern coast of the country, where the largest portion of Black South Africans also live. So you have to start asking the question, but do you really think that the majority of land in KwaZulu-Natal, the majority of land in the Eastern Cape is white owned? If you drive through that area, you're going to get a different picture.
Yeah, so I mean, it baffles my mind. But there's another thing that is going missing here, and that is that people have a tendency worldwide to move towards cities or towns, right? There's migration to cities and towns. And here we are told to do what has gone against everything we know about classical developmental theory, which is to resettle people en masse in the countryside. How on earth is that going to work in South Africa, especially given the climatic conditions that we've got?
Yeah, well, you're going to have to ask Cyril. He wants to build a bunch of smart cities and create some new towns and some new cities out of nothing. So we're going to have to see how he achieves that. And I think this is also something that came to the fore in my presentation before Parliament, was this whole theme of the hunger for land. So naturally, when you look at, for example, the squatter camps in cities, of course, there's a hunger for more space. People don't want to live on top of each other like that. But at the same time, when our politicians talk about the hunger for land, they are talking about a hunger for agricultural land. And this is absolutely not the case. And this was one of the main big pieces of my presentation before Parliament, was just to throw the statistics at them in regards to the hunger for specifically agricultural land. So
how many agricultural farmers do we have in South Africa? Like
commercial farmers?
I'm not talking about ventergat boere, guys who can barely.
Commercial farmers, we have between 30 and 40,000.
Okay, so here's what I'm saying. If we have, say, 30, 40,000 commercial farmers in the country, and we get the base black farmers that are trained in agriculture, and we assume 100% competency, and they can take over tomorrow, and we give the white people's land to the black people's land, then you still have only 40,000 black farm owners. You're not going to give everyone land if you want to operate them in the same way we run a modern economy. And nobody is seeing through that argument. If you subdivide the land, you're going to create poverty, unemployment, famine, all the issues that came with Zimbabwe and Cambodia. So what do they want to achieve here? I mean, because I cannot understand the ANC's end goal in terms of land.
Well, they pretty much want to give themselves the tools to be able to hand pieces of land to the politically connected and to their equivalent of war veterans. And they want to be able to control the use of land and not be able to lease it to the politically connected and people with the right connections. So pretty much the statistics that I gave in that presentation that laid this all bare was pretty much these. So 82% of all land claims that have been lodged through the restitution process that is in place. So maybe just for context before I continue, the restitution process is pretty much that since 1994, or since I think a little bit later, I don't know exactly when it started, I think a few years after 1994, but you can pretty much, if you go to the government and you can prove to them, I have an ancestral claim to this piece of land, my family were dispossessed under the previous regime, you can get that land back. So, and the government has been very thorough in actually keeping logs of all the statistics of these land claims. So the statistics that I'm about to give you are the statistics of the government. These aren't Afriforum statistics. So 82% of all land claims were lodged in urban areas, not in rural areas or for farmland. 93% of all claimants preferred financial compensation over land. 93% wanted money rather than land. 95% of all land reform projects in South Africa, or land that has been allocated by the government, it's been expropriated, given to new owners. 95% of those have failed, and those commercial farms have been converted to subsistence farms and squatter camps.
So I just don't want to get confused in the statistics here. So you say 90% of the land claims have been successfully handled by the courts. What is that statistic?
No, approximately 95% of all land claims have already been settled.
Okay. And of that 95%, the majority of them were in urban areas, not in rural areas.
Yes. Yeah, okay. 82% were in urban areas.
Okay, so it's 82% of 95%. Yeah. So the remaining, 18% of 95%, that was in, those were in
rural areas.
In rural areas, right. And those were primarily the lands that people wanted what? Still the cash, or they still wanted to farm?
No, the percentage regarding the financial compensation pretty much encompasses urban and rural claims. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so but then you make a point of farms being taken over by government, meaning the person didn't get the land itself. What percentage of the 95% is that?
Of the 95% that have been settled?
Yeah.
So this is the 95% of that have failed are of the government's land reform projects. So that's where they've expropriated a farm, not specifically given it to someone that's had a historical claim there. They've given it to some young black entrepreneur. Say, okay, here's your seed and here's your tools. You're a project now. You're a land reform project. We're going to support you to really pretty much.
But that young black entrepreneur that got the land, he does not own the property that the government is supposed to run for him or own.
As I understand it, they do transfer it over to him.
Okay, and still that has failed. So
yes, because they were pretty much from what I've seen, the majority of those land reform projects were given to either politically connected people with no knowledge about farming, or they were given to people with knowledge about farming, but those people weren't given the right resources or the right support. They were doomed to fail from the start. I mean, you can see this actually in Afriforum's documentary, Disrupted Land. We talked to some of these landowners, black farmers that were given land by the government, and then the government said, well, we'll give you tractors and we'll give you seed and we'll give you manure, don't worry. And then they only give like 10 or 15% of what they promised, and then those projects just fail because there was no way that farmer was going to.
So to be clear, not even the best white farmer in the country can farm successfully under those conditions.
Yeah, no, not even the best white farmer would be able to make a commercial success with that little bit of support, if that was what you were promised and you were not using any of your own money.
Right. So then I get to the point of land. Let's still stick a bit on the farmers. So there's no big hunger for land. At least there's no big hunger for agriculture. There is a hunger for land in urban areas, right? Mm. But in terms of agriculture, okay, what is the farmer's views here now? Because you get, as I say, you get ventergatboere, farmers that in my view don't really matter. I think we have the 80-20 principle, like 20% of all farmers produce probably 80% of all the food in the country. What do those guys who seriously feed the country feel about this whole process?
In regard, just repeat the question.
What do they feel about transferring ownership, about giving shares to black companies? Like, how is that going? Is there any talks of that, or is it just talks of taking all the land altogether?
Well, the thing is, the government isn't interested in. There are many cases of farmers actually trying to help people in their community develop their land, develop their property, give them a stake in farms. But the problem is with government is that the government's only language that they understand is force. So when it comes to what the government sees as land reform, it is not supporting those farmers that are actually trying to help their community. It's pretty much taking as much as they can from those farmers, dividing it up amongst the cadres, and giving a little bit maybe to one or two farmers in the community, black farmers, just to get a nice photo op.
You see, you get a problem here, which is an allocation of resources. It's the problem that Hayek spoke about. As soon as you centralize knowledge, for example, which is the point of distribution. So you've got a government that has to distribute land. You find a problem of intelligence. The government does not know how to allocate the resources, and generally, as you say, it goes to the cronies of the government. There's also a principle in economics, I've got the name now, that resources in a free market or assets in a free market will eventually be handled by the most competent people. So, for example, if I give the land equally to everyone in South Africa, every South African gets 1/10 of the land, eventually people are going to start trading it because I'm not a farmer, I'm an engineer, for example. And slowly but surely, you're going to find a distribution which is not equally or normally distributed that benefits those with productive capability of the assets. So you find this problem that, let's say tomorrow the government says, they're going to take the land, give it to the black population. They're going to be having 30 or 40,000 black farmers in the country. And maybe those black farmers will realize, I'm not really a farmer. They're going to start selling it. Who are they going to sell it to? If it's not, it's probably going to end up back in the hands of the white population in a free market economy, or those who are qualified to farm.
Well, it's not even that. There are actually cases in South Africa where you get some very strange stories specifically about that, what you're talking about. So there's this one story, or this one case, where there was a piece of traditional land that was through a land claim given back to a little tribe in the area. but they didn't have the means to develop it. They didn't really know what to do with it. They didn't have the capital to really plow back into the land. So they pretty much lived there. And then they were approached by some very wealthy Belgian investors that said, well, we want to turn this very lovely piece of land into a lodging area. Or like a game reserve. What do you want for it? And then the owner of the land, or the traditional leader that owns that piece of land, pretty much just told them that he wants, if I remember correctly, a one new car every year and one elephant to eat for him and his tribe every month. And you see that with in another example as well. There was the case of Joe Slovo Park in Cape Town, where there was this piece of land that was pretty much a land reform project. There were people living there and they were given government housing. But because these people were so poor, and when you are given property and when you are given a house, you have to start paying taxes, you have to start paying expenses to maintain that house. Things break, you have to pretty much, a lot of expenses go with owning a house. And then they realize, and then they are approached by, let's say, some foreign businessman that says, or an entrepreneur in South Africa that says, well, I'll give you 5,000 Rand upfront for your house right now. And then they take that offer, and then they sell their house, and then they are homeless again, and that person that bought it just rents it out to other people. So these are the types of stories that you hear. So the land reform is not just such a simple thing. You can't just give a piece of land or a piece of property to someone and give it to someone that doesn't have the capital or the money to really invest in it or maintain it, or give a farm or a commercial project to someone that doesn't have the background or the knowledge to develop it or to make it commercially successful. And that's just something that the government just can't grasp, it seems.
Well, I have the impression that our government has the inability to grasp free markets. I read a book by George Shultz a few years ago. It was Ronald Reagan's foreign Secretary of State at the time when he was dealing with Gorbachev. And he also said he could talk to the communists at the time and he could give them the arguments and the statistics and everything. They just couldn't get markets into their heads. They just didn't understand how a market operates. And I get this impression from the South African government that these guys have got a weird warped vision of how the economy works, of how land works. I mean, land in itself is useless. You can give me a farm today in South Africa. If I'm sitting in Paris, it doesn't mean anything, right? It only means something if it produces. And they seem to miss this economic concept that it is what you do with the land. It's who runs it. It's ultimately human capital that creates wealth. It's not resources. And you can see it when Malema talks in Parliament, for example, about minerals, where he says South Africa is the most mineral-rich country in the world. Well, it's just not true. We have the most minerals, or third most, whatever it might be. But if the minerals stay in the ground, they're totally useless.
Well, I think what people don't understand, firstly, if you ever visited a farm or if you grew up in a farming community, you'll know that a farm is a business. It's not just planting seeds in the ground. You can plant an entire field of seeds and still not be able to make a profit if you don't manage it correctly. Farming is not something that you just pick up. It's not planting vegetables in your backyard. It's a fully fledged, massive business, and it's
hard
not just
work. Most people don't want to do it, and it doesn't pay that well. The farmers are not that rich either.
Yeah, you have to wake up at 3 a.m, at 4 a.m, and you work the entire day. You don't. I remember visiting my friends on farms. I grew up in a farming community, and I remember you saw their father only a few times a day. The rest of the day, he was running around. He was driving around, going from this corner of the farm to this corner of the farm. Here something broke. Here something needs to be fixed. Here someone needs his advice. Here someone needs his judgment on something. Here he needs to go sign some paper. Here he needs to paint something. The farmer's life is not one of sitting on your stoop drinking a double brandy and Coke and watching the seeds grow.
Also it's streaming or doing live streams on YouTube.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've spent some time with farmers, and listen, farms are different. Somebody who manages a game farm, for example, is not going to manage sheep in the Karoo, for example. These are highly specialized fields, and you need my belief is a specific type of personality to manage it. And some of those farms you can't really learn in a book how to run it. You grow up on the farm. So, all these complications of human capital is just skipped over entirely by the government when we talk about land reform.
Well, these things are not really very suitable for a political speech. You don't really want to go into these details if you want to rile people up. You can just listen to a Julius Malema speech and you'll know it's about the small details. It's about the little things that really, the simple sloganeering that really gets the people going. And that's the thing about, I've been giving you a bunch of statistics here tonight, but that won't work in a speech. It just won't get people to vote for you to give them all this statistics. It's a bunch of numbers. They're going to look at you and say, well, I don't understand this. I'm not a person that's into all these mathematics and stuff that you're throwing at me. I just want to know, will I be able to be better off next month than I am now? Will I be able to have a more comfortable life if I elect you? Yes or no? That's what I want to know. And the populists, specifically the redistributive populists, can pretty much very easily answer that question. And it's a big fat yes. If you vote for me, everything will be better. Nothing will be worse. It's the easiest choice you've had.
That comes into my next talking point, which is the propaganda. Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels said that the message just has to be simple and you have to repeat it constantly. It doesn't even have to be true. And people will eventually start believing it. And we can see this with land. All whites are thieves. The land was stolen from us. It's all apartheid's fault. It's Van Riebeeck's fault. It's very easy. You create angels and demons and you dumb down the message so everyone can understand it.
Well, that's pretty much been the recipe of propaganda for the majority of human history. And that's what we saw with my research into populist movements as well, is that you need to create a narrative. So life, in your view or in your framing of it, needs to more resemble a film than reality. So there needs to be a villain or villains. There needs to be a protagonist or a group, a pure group and a corrupted group. And there needs to be a struggle between these two. And you are, of course, on the side of the oppressed group or the group that's struggling against the corrupted elite group. And that's pretty much the building blocks of any type of populist movement, is you'll find that type of dichotomy. Secondly, as well, when you are standing up against the establishment, there's no better way to distinguish yourself from the status quo than to pretty much break all their rules and all their decorum. And the EFF is a good example of this. Whereas the establishment likes the suited politician that talks eloquently, that probably puts some statistics into his speeches. The populist is trying to distance himself from that. So what does he do? He swears openly in Parliament. He wears a red tracksuit. He tweets on Twitter like he's a high school girl that just found a copy of Das Kapital, but has only read like the little quotes online. But now she's a communist. That's the type of rhetoric you get from populists, and it's very effective in the broader picture because they're much more human in regards to how they conduct themselves as well. Look at, for example, a politician like Julius Malema, and look at a politician like Cyril Ramaphosa. Julius Malema is much more in the way that he speaks. He speaks like a regular person. He doesn't speak with big academic terms. He doesn't use terms like lackadaisical, for crying out loud. He doesn't have people giving him all these very lofty speeches writing these lofty speeches for him that News 24 can call majestic. He has a Julius Malema
talks to the audience, right? But I looked at I studied German at university as well, and obviously when you study German you eventually get to Adolf Hitler. And, in German, the R, for example, it's the re, it's at the back of the mouth. But there's some dialects where they use the r like we do. And apparently Hitler was a master at mimicking the variant and the dialect of the people he was speaking towards. He had a very good way of, breaking down the simplistic narrative. It's only the Jews' fault.
So he was the inverse of Musi Maimane.
Yes, well, exactly. I mean, if you come with unsophisticated speech, this is how propaganda is created. I spoke to Richard Lindzen about this, who's the MIT professor that opposes climate fanaticism. And, the climate's changing. That's another thing of, what does it mean? Well, climate changes. It's so easy. We all understand it. So we can blame every weather event on it. And he studied two particular phenomena, which was eugenics and the Lysenkoism. Now, eugenics was discredited with the Holocaust, and Lysenkoism was discredited with the famines of Stalin. And he asked himself, how is it that sophisticated scientific concepts could be filtered down to the Nazi foot soldiers, for example, or to the Red Army? And he made the point, he said, well, eugenics, it's epigenetics, right? It's a very complicated theory, actually. But if you break it down, I tell you, you've only got a gene for blue eyes. You only have a gene for feeble-mindedness, or you have a gene for being ugly. Ordinary people could understand it. And this is how it filtered down to the ordinary people. It was the same with Lysenkoism. Lysenko, okay, he was a bit of an amateur himself, but he believed that you could plant crops to adapt to climatic conditions. Now, it's true that crops do evolve to climatic conditions, but it doesn't make sense to plant citrus trees in Siberia, for example. And he got the local farmers, which were not very educated in Russia at the time, to plant it, and it caused the famines of Stalin. And here we have, with the ANC, a comparable example. We have, as we just talked, a complex history of South Africa. I mean, you can read deep books about the history of conquest, of cooperation, of warfare, of people coming to save each other, of the British even colonizing the Afrikaners, of the Afrikaners later doing something comparable. There's a complex history to South Africa. We haven't even touched on Nkosi, the effect of Shaka's reign of terror in Africa.
Yeah, and then Fikani.
The Mfikani, they all played a role in shaping the way South Africa is today. And then comes population growth, for example. You get migration, you had droughts, certain drought and raining patterns. All of that gave the complex land issue we've got today. But that is a complex theory for statisticians and for people that know what they're talking about. Let's break it simple and say it's all white, it's all the farmers' fault. And that's how propaganda gets filtered out.
Well, it actually touches on that point that I made earlier, where the populist talks like a regular person. Well, the regular person talks in simple terms. And I'm not talking about the regular person in a condescending way. I'm talking about even how I talk to my friends. When I'm talking to my friends at the braai, I'm not talking to them in academic terms. We're not discussing complex mathematics and statistics. We are simplifying reality to a very large extent, because if we were to really get into the meat of everything that we talked about and the deep nuances of every conversation, we'd never be able to move past the first topic. So, of course, regular conversation between people is simplified, and that's something that actually populists have pretty much very well harnessed. But a final point that I wanted to make on the government's, the South African government's targets with expropriation and land reform is the fact that, so I think you've heard about the 30% target that they had. So there's this 30% target that the government keeps changing. So initially the land reform target was set at 30% of the country's area in 1995 needed to be redistributed, or land reform needed to put 30%.
Was that 30% well defined at the time?
No, I'm not quite sure in regards to how well it was defined. I'm talking about in their rhetoric, in regards to not government documents, but specifically how the ANC were phrasing it in their rhetoric around the issue. And then it soon became apparent that this goal had already been achieved. If you went into the statistics, you could see that 30% of land in private hands was already owned by Black South Africans.
It sounds to me like 3 weeks to flatten the curve.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So then, and then also, if you take state-owned land into account, it completely destroys that percentage, because then the government is majority Black, so even more land is in Black hands in South Africa. Then that 30% really just is overshadowed. So then the target changed to 30% of all high-potential agricultural land, as set out in the Agri-SA BEE document of 2005.
Let's just pause there for a moment, right? So nobody's going to say that my ancestors were robbed of high potential agricultural land. You're already moving to the absurd from what if you say, okay, my ancestors were taken off the land, fine, there's a comparable case. Now we've achieved the land reform, and now we're like, wait a minute, it's the high potential agricultural land back then that was expropriated. That's now the new target.
Yeah, but you see, this is the moving of the goalposts to once they realize that their previous goal had actually been already reached. So then the target changed to, like I said, 30% of, and this is a direct quote from the document, all high potential agricultural land. And this was in the Agri-SA-BEE document of 2005. But then it also became clear a year or so onwards that this goal had also been achieved quite markedly. So then they had to change it again. So eventually what we are sitting with today, the current rhetorical conceptualization of that 30%, is that the target was changed to the current race-based formula of 30% of all white-owned agricultural land needs to be redistributed for successful land reform to be accomplished.
So what percentage of the original land, however that's defined, is still owned by white people?
In regards to today, what percentage is owned by white people? Well, if you look at the figures provided by the government's 2017 land audit, where this allegation of white people own the majority of land comes from, and this has been quoted by the EFF, Ramaphosa, and whatever, and I think one of the statistics that they use is 72% of all individual land is in white hands. This is one of their quotes. So the land under individual ownership makes up less than a third of the size of the land in South Africa, according to the land audit itself. This means that the land that is individually owned by whites makes up only 21.9% of the size of South Africa. This is less than the total size of the state-owned land.
So let's just get that straight. Whites own 21% of South Africa at the moment.
Yeah, even if you go on the 72% of all individually owned land, let's say that's true. Even if that's true, that means 21% of the size of South Africa is in white hands if you take the size of state-owned land into account.
Right. And so 21%, and of the 21%, that's all commercial farmland we're talking about now.
This is individually owned land, so I think this could be your house as well, or your backyard.
So farmland is a proportion of that even, and this is now where we get into the reality of this thing, where it's like it's not 72%. That's just a lie. But again, it's Goebbels' technique. We keep on repeating the same lie because it's simplistic. Whites own 72%. It's unjust. We are 70%. They own what we should own.
Yeah. Well, seeing as we're on the topic of fertile land and agricultural potential land, here's another stat for you that you can take to the bank. So according to a 2017 land audit by Agri-SA, and as well as me that Agri-SA aren't the biggest enemies of government, so they're not going to really create anti-ANC propaganda. Black South Africans own more than or almost half of all agricultural land in 3 of South Africa's most fertile provinces. So in these 3 of South Africa's most fertile provinces, Black South Africans own either the majority of or almost half of the agricultural land.
What are those 3 provinces? Eastern Cape,
Cape, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal.
Okay, so Eastern Cape, Limpopo, KwaZulu-Natal. So KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape's got lots of water. It's as opposed to Limpopo, where I'm from. Limpopo, we struggle with water. So in the in the 2 provinces with the highest amount of rainfall, and rainfall is an issue in South Africa. It's not like Europe that you've got sand everywhere. Black people already own more than half of all the land.
And in addition to that, non-white landowners control more than 46% of South Africa's agricultural potential. So in KwaZulu-Natal alone, 45% of agricultural land, the surface area, is owned by Black people. And this represents 72.5% of the agricultural potential of the province.
And that includes the land owned by the now deceased King Goodwill Zwelithini.
Yes.
Okay. So because nobody talks about what we used to call tribal lands.
That's too complicated, Iru.
Because there was an interesting thing to me, which is that most of the poor in South Africa is still living in the former homelands areas, right? And nobody is talking about the fact that the people living there are living under government land. They don't own property because that belongs to the chiefs, or the kings.
Well, something else that I think is also pretty mind-blowing, and that a lot of people don't know about, is that in a special report by the Center for Development and Enterprise, it's stated that a total of 17 billion hectares, 17 million hectares have been transferred from white ownership to black ownership since 1994, which is equivalent to 21% of the fully owned agricultural land in South Africa. So there has been a massive transfer of agricultural land in South Africa, 17 million hectares to be exact. And this is something that's just completely ignored by politicians when it comes to the topic of land reform in South Africa.
So, there's a phenomenon in statistics, I forget the name again, where a problem appears to be worse when it's already been solved. So to give you an example, in the US, they started talking about sex education after deaths from venereal diseases started going down, for example. And I think this is something that is comparable. The problem looks, at least to the ANC, like a massive issue, and yet the market solved it. It seems to me that the white population is owning, land which is more or less proportionate to their capabilities, you would say, and probably less, or probably more or less according to the population numbers. We're already there, and yet the government's trying to solve a problem which is almost non-existent.
Well, then that actually brings us to the solution, and that's so what do you do about it? And this is one of the questions that was asked to me in my presentation to Parliament. And the answer is absolutely 100% not expropriation without compensation. Firstly, there is a restitution process in place. There is a process where if you can prove that your ancestors were dispossessed under the previous government, you can get your land back. The process is there. Unfortunately, this process is horrifically corrupt. And this is not overstating.
I'm so surprised that you tell me.
The process... The process is there. The everything is in place, but the ANC is really making a expert or what it. I remember. I don't know if you watch football, but there's this famous quote from Jose Mourinho about Arsene Wenger, the manager of Arsenal, and he said he's an expert in failure. So, and I think the ANC are definitely not just experts in failure, but experts in corruption. And that's what we're seeing here specifically with this restitution process. So firstly, the process is there. It just needs to be done correctly and non-corruptly. That is how you're going to right the wrongs of the past, if you want to use that term. Secondly, and this is something we have touched on in this discussion so far, is funding. If there are young black farmers in South Africa that want to get started, that want to get into the sector, but they can't build up to that to become commercially viable, because that takes a lot of money, that takes a lot of resources, and the government can provide them with that support. And they have promised that support to many farmers, but as we've seen, a lot of those farmers don't get what they were promised. They don't get the resources, they don't get the tools. They're promised all this feed and manure, and they don't get it, or the government just stops giving it to them.
Because you see, you get this weird idea from the government. They've got this vision in their head again of there's a problem. 72% of all land is white land, and yet they cannot. First of all, they cannot get. They don't understand their own statistics, because the statistics you've quoted me are from their own sources. And the second problem is the process which was supposed to give restitution where it was legitimate is corrupt. So if you take that same process and you're going to multiply it across South Africa and achieve God knows what, you're only going to have a corrupt state. It's going to be chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why I made the point, and this is what it wasn't in my presentation. This was in another interview that I did a while back on expropriation. I think I was on SABC, and they asked, so why shouldn't government have the power to expropriate without compensation, or why shouldn't the government be in charge of who gets the land? And I said, well, this is the same government that's in charge of Eskom, the Post Office, South African Airways, and pretty much any SOE that you can name. If you can name me one that's a massive success, that would really be a shocker to me. But this is the same government that brought you all these massive comic failures of SOEs, and you want to give them something as massive as control over all the land. You got to be smoking something very strong, my guy, if you think that is a good idea. If you can look me straight in the face, even if you're the biggest ANC supporter, and you look at, for example, Eskom and South African Airways, and you tell me you want to put that same government in charge of all the land, and you can do that with a straight face,
they're going to get Andre the Writer
that would
to
be
run it
very
for them.
impressive to me. And that's what I just find so funny, is this blind spot of all these praise singers and cheerleaders for the ANC, and say, oh, don't worry, let's just give them a monopoly on vaccines, let's just give them a monopoly on all the land, let's just give them a monopoly on everything. Don't worry, it's going to be fine. But every single monopoly that they get into their hands, they have this reverse Midas touch, where everything they touch turns into a corrupt mess.
Yeah, if it's going to be like the vaccine rollout, it's
I think they said that they were going to vaccinate, I don't know how many million people by the end of March, but I think they
went from natural herd immunity.
Yeah, they're 0.6% towards their goal at this point on the 30th of March today.
Well, I don't know if you saw the graph of countries, but Zimbabwe is achieving their goal of vaccination at a higher rate than South Africa. So we are really
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Look, I want to get to another talking point.
Yeah, I'm not going to contest you on that. I didn't see that stat, but I'll believe you.
You see, that's the problem. It's so believable, I can make it up as well. I didn't, but it's that's a big problem. I want to get quickly to the prospect of property rights. Okay, and I spoke to Leon Lowe on this show on Sunday on property rights, and I'm going to get Barry Feldman as well from the Free Market Foundation, who works for Kaya Land Product. There's a lot of Black people in South Africa who don't own property at the moment. They own their houses, but they don't have title deeds, right? And one thing that every South African should stand for is to give the people title deeds for their land. It's like apartheid's longest lasting legacy is Black people in South Africa at this moment can get title deeds, but the government hasn't bothered to hand them out yet, so they cannot trade their property.
Well, that was the other large part of my master's thesis, was I contrasted these redistributive populist regimes of Venezuela and Zimbabwe, where property rights were violated, with two regimes or two countries where property rights were defended and enforced and protected, and those two countries were Uruguay and Botswana. So let's take two countries that pretty much will demonstrate this very perfectly in regards to the value of property rights. It's not going to be specifically in regards to giving people property rights title deeds, but it's going to make that point of property rights. So take the two countries of Venezuela and Botswana. Now you can say, well, Botswana is rich because they've got diamonds. Well, a lot of people don't know Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and those people probably would have thought it probably is like Saudi Arabia or one of these Middle Eastern countries. No,
that was Chavez with the name I cannot repeat because I feel ashamed. His idea was that the oil wealth is going to fund the country, and it worked well for about 2 years, more or less, and then it started draining. I've got friends from Venezuela.
Well, that's what they did. Is that if you contrast those two countries, what the Venezuelan government did was they pretty much they got greedy. They wanted everything, so they nationalized the entire oil industry, put it all under government control, so they can take that oil money vein and just directly connect that to their coffers. And all that happened was their money. Their bank accounts didn't fill up. They just pretty much wasted it all. The entire industry fell apart, and they got to a point where they've got all this oil under the ground, but they don't have the machinery left to extract it. So it's just they've got the largest oil reserves in the world. They can't even get it out.
That speaks again to the inability of the social communists, whatever you want to call them, the centralists, to understand basic economics, which is ultimate wealth is what is between your ears. It is not what's in the ground. So you can have the most oil in the world. It's not going to get you anywhere. And the best way to allocate resources is through property rights.
So now let's take the case of Botswana. Again, they've got a large natural resource, diamonds, but what they did was they pretty much just negotiated with the diamond industry. The diamond industry understood there was a metric ton of money to be made here. They wanted a slice of that, so they pretty much negotiated with the government. The Botswana government said, give us a slice of the income or a slice of the profits that we can invest that into infrastructure, use that to develop the country. You can have the rest of the profits and you can keep your property rights. We won't touch them. And the diamond companies were just like, I can't shake your hand fast enough. So Botswana went from a country that at independence in 1965 had only 12 kilometers of tarred roads.
Yeah.
And they didn't have a university at that time. All their students had to go
And the
study
capital was in
Africa.
South Africa at the time, in
Yeah,
King.
yeah. So they pretty much at that time they weren't a country. If you were betting money on that horse, people would have looked at you like you're crazy. In comparison to their neighbors, Zimbabwe, who when they gained their independence in 1980, were pretty much people were saying this is going to be the next big thing.
Yeah.
They've got this incredibly complex economy. They've got a thriving agricultural sector. They've got at that time also one of a stock market that some of the most capital was flowing towards. Everything was on the up. If you bet on that horse, people would have looked at you and said, well, that's a solid investment. But if you look at what Botswana was able to do then with that money from the diamond industry, by not threatening the diamond companies by saying we were going to take all your mines and going to violate your property rights, they pretty much were able to build themselves up to a point where they are one of the gems of Africa today. Another good example would be, if you look at, for example, the culture of the Tswanas in Botswana, they've always had a culture of property rights and strong property rights within their culture. So I think that is something that played a role. I actually went into a little bit into the cultural factor in my master's thesis.
The interesting thing about Botswana to me was look, there were lots of missionaries working there when it was still called Botswana land. It was a poor place. And they spread Christianity through the country. But what Sir Sekama did at that time is he did not chase the white population away like Robert Mugabe did. He told them, stay here, help us run the place until we know how to do it ourselves. So they admitted there was an ignorance to their own knowledge. Not knowing something doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means that, you need to learn first to run the country. And Botswana actually adopted the Christian religion, which was quite remarkable, without any resistance. And, subsequently they embraced property rights, the rule of law. And if you take the country that has grown the fastest in the last 50 years, people don't believe me, but when I say this to them, it's not been China, it's not been Taiwan, it's not been an Asian tiger, it's Botswana. Botswana has had the longest sustained growth rate for 50 years. Yeah. And it's a desert. And most of it, so you can take a desert land, you can make it prosperous. The same happened with Dubai, for example.
When they gained independence, Botswana had 12 kilometers of tarred roads.
Yeah, 12 kilometers of tarred roads when, they have no educated people. But it's that type of mindset that helps build the country. So you take other examples of property rights going haywire when they lose it. Cambodia is probably the worst example of communism. And in certain senses, to me, it's worse than Stalinism has been. Stalin is another example of how the kulaks were chased out of their property because they know how to they knew how to manage it properly. Red China under Mao, you take the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, for example, was primarily based on property rights. So everywhere in the world where people's been given property rights, people prosper. When you take it away, people don't prosper. There's a good book written by Hernando de Soto, The Power of the Poor, on debt capital, for example, where he shows in his home country of Peru, he gave people property rights. As soon as the people around the urban slums were given a title deed, all of a sudden they started entering the middle class. It's not complicated science.
Well, to simplify it even more, to get back to the whole farm issue or the owning of a farm, why would you invest anything into a farm that the government can take away from you just by snapping their fingers?
Right.
If you don't have complete property rights over your property or where your business is situated, why would you develop it in any way? Why would you invest a cent into something that can just be taken away tomorrow? And the same type of logic goes for foreign investors and foreign companies. For example, if you are a mineral-rich country like South Africa, why would a company come to your country to build a mine that can just be nationalized tomorrow by the government, or the property of the mine or the assets of the mine can just be expropriated, as we saw with the expropriation bill, where they can pretty much expropriate any type of property? I mean, if they like the lorries that you use to drive around at your mine and they want to give that to some carters, they can come take it. So why would you do it? So you'd rather go to a country like Botswana that pretty much tells you, hey, you can extract as much as you want. Just give me a little bit now and then that I can use to develop my country, but you can take the vast majority of the revenue. You're going to snap the handle.
I have a lot of contact with international businessmen in South Africa and throughout Africa, actually, especially in the energy sector. And, they're not going to South Africa anymore. I had a few people telling me the government's rules is too complicated. We cannot supply electricity over there. They were willing to invest, put their money down. And then every now and then in the back corner, you hear this property rights. People are aware of this. They say, yes, they might still invest there, but they're hesitant. They're not going to throw all the eggs in all baskets. They would rather go to Rwanda, to Uganda, to Botswana, countries that respect their property rights and respect their investment. Because ultimately, businessmen care about making money. It's not complicated. If you cannot protect the investment, they're not going to put your money down.
Absolutely, and it's very simple when you think about it in that way. But then again, you don't. When you're a politician in South Africa, that simple truth is not going to really serve you very well. So of course, you're not going to be using that. But that's the reality, and I mean that was the central conclusion of my master's thesis, was the fact that these countries that were pretty much protecting property rights and enforcing them were doing so much better in terms of poverty reduction, in regards to economic growth, in regards to political stability. The list goes on and on. And maybe just the last thing here before we conclude, there was something that I found very fascinating while doing my research. So when I was looking at, for example, these 4 case studies, I started off by looking at Uruguay and Botswana, and I was looking at all these types of statistics, like inflation statistics and all the related stuff. And it was so easy to find. Everything was there. Everything was public. Everything was transparent. It was excellent. Like, it was pretty much a dream for a researcher. Then I move on to Venezuela and to Zimbabwe. And then those 2 countries, when it comes to, for example, inflation statistics, there's just a point where they decide, we're just not going to publish it anymore. You don't need to know. It's not important.
I think you're being biased against communist regimes over there, Ernst.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Ernst. Last question. Yeah, it's totally unrelated to this. Mozambique. We saw this week something of a horror story in Mozambique, where the South African military companies or private military operations, security companies, whatever they call it, are being accused of war crimes. We have Al-Shabaab. You don't have this, Al-Shabaab's name is synonymous with war crimes. Do you have a view on Mozambique and how it's going to affect South Africa?
Well, I don't think we can afford another dysfunctional state on our borders, so that's very worrying. And this is a new element, something that we haven't dealt with really in South Africa, and that is a radical Islamic insurgents. I think it's going to have a massive impact on the Southern African region, and we're going to have to see what happens. But unfortunately, it doesn't look good. I saw now today there was a breaking news story of Portugal sending some troops there to help support them. But the situation's looking bad. A lot of very disturbing stuff coming from there.
I would like for people to take it seriously because, first of all, just from an economic point of view, I know it's not always the best place to start. Total is investing $20 billion in cheap natural gas, which can lift millions of people out of poverty in Africa, coming from Mozambique. South Africa can solve a great deal of our energy needs if that pipeline is built. Al-Shabaab is attacking that. But more concerning to me is the humanitarian element. There's now 500,000 displaced refugees, where half of that, 250,000, are children, on Mozambique, on our border. We are going to see a migrant wave to South Africa if we don't take it seriously. I don't know how to deal with it. Is it private security firms? Is it a UN operation? Is it SADC security force? But our government has to start looking at what's happening in Mozambique. And, my parents don't stay in Polokwane. It's a few thousand kilometers, but it's not inconceivable that they will be the first city hit with refugees when they start hitting South Africa.
Well, not just that. So there are a lot of risks associated with that type of development, but at the same time, I think the worst case scenario would be the soft diplomacy that we handled the Zimbabwe crisis with back in the day, to take that same approach here with Mozambique. Now, I think that's really something that needs to be given a lot more attention. I hope people keep up to date with it. Thank you very much for informing people. I think it's something that can have very grave consequences for the region. So I'm keeping a close eye on it, but things aren't looking good.
Yeah, Ernst, thank you very much. And again, everyone should subscribe to your channel. Please give me your master's thesis. I'll put it in the link description. People should start reading it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, have a great evening, everyone. Thanks for a good chat, Ihu. If you are interested in my videos, you can just search Conscious Caracal on YouTube and go check out my channel. And you'll see some conversations with Ihu there as well. But thank you very much, Ihu. It was an excellent chat. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I'll definitely chat to you again in the future. You just need to let me know.
Thank you.